Right, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Welcome everybody to session 24. What a time. World is not in a good place at the moment. Today, I'm going to kind of insist on keeping our session to the 1 hour mark precisely because Nuri and my daughter and I have to be somewhere at about 1:30 our time. So the chapter is short, so I should get through it in about 10, 15 minutes, if not less. And then I'll open the floor as usual, do our questions. But at the 1 hour mark, I'm afraid we're going to have to end the session. Anywho, hope everybody is doing well. Let's get cracking. The wisdom of breath, Hikmat al-Nafasiyya, or according to Qaisari Nafsiyya, in the Word of Jonah, في كلمة اليونسية. Know that this human creation in all its spiritual, physical, and psychic perfection was created by God in his own image, and that none but he has charge of its dissolution, whether by his hand, which is always the case, or by his command. Whoever takes it on himself without God's command wrongs his own soul, transgresses the bounds of God, and seeks the destruction of him whose proper functioning God has ordered. Indeed, solicitude in caring for God's servants is better than killing them from an excessive zeal for God. Here's your response to Western liberals and the philosophers of the so-called European Enlightenment who believe that they created the concept of human rights. Right here in this very first paragraph of the Fusus al-Hikam, we have Ibn Arabi, of all people, expositing the most clear philosophy of human rights in the medieval period. To go on, David desired to build the holy house and did so several times. However, every time he finished it, it fell down in ruins. When he complained of that to God, God revealed to him, "My house shall not be raised by the hand of one who has spilt blood." David then said, "O Lord, was it not done in your cause?" God said to him, "Indeed, but are they not my servants?" Then David said, "O Lord, let it then be built by the one who is of me." God then revealed to him that his son Solomon would build it. May this same wisdom suffice for our current time as well, inshallah. The moral here concerns the proper maintenance of this human creation and that its raising up is better than its destruction. Have you not considered how God has ordained the poll tax, the jizya, and the truce for dealing with the enemies of the faith, so that he might spare them? He says, "If they incline to please, incline to it yourselves and trust in God." Have you not also considered how, in the case of retaliation, the injured party is encouraged to exact a ransom or to forgive, and that only if he refuses these may the man be killed? Indeed, when there are many injured parties, one of them is ready to accept payment while the others insist on execution. It is the former rather than the latter whose decision is accepted, thus averting the death of the wrongdoer. Also, the apostle said of the owner of the thong, if he kills him, he's then no better than he. God says, the recompense of one evil is an evil like it, referring to retaliation as an evil action, even though it is legal. But whoever forgives and does good, his reward is with God, because he is in his image. So whoever forgives and does not kill will be rewarded by him in whose image he is, since he has most right to him, having created him for that to be in his image. This is because God is manifest in the name, the outer, as Zahir, only through his existence, that whoever preserves him preserves God, meaning the servant. Man is not blameworthy in himself, but only because of the act that proceeds from him. This act is not the same as his human self, and it is of this that we are speaking. Although there is no act in truth but God's, some are considered worthy of blame while others are praised. To pronounce blame for one's own purpose is itself blameworthy in God's sight, since only that which the law blames is truly blameworthy. The censure of the law is a wisdom that only God or one who he has taught knows, just as he has ordained retaliation in the interest of preserving humankind and as a deterrent to one who would transgress God's bounds. In retaliation, there's a life for you, or you who are intelligent. Such are the ones who perceive the essence of things and who have discovered the secrets of God's laws. When you have realized that God has care of this human creation and its rearing, you yourself should care for it all the more, which will bring you felicity. This is because while a man still has life, he has the opportunity to achieve that perfection for which he was created, so that whoever tries to destroy him is seeking to prevent his achieving that for which he was made. How fine was the saying of the apostle of God, "Shall I tell you of something much better than engaging the enemy, attacking them and being attacked by them? It is the remembrance of God." That is because only he who remembers God properly appreciates the true worth of this human creation. For it is God who is the companion of the one who remembers him. And the companion is perceived by the one who remembers. Excuse me. If the rememberer or invoker, dhakar, does not perceive God, who is his companion? Then he is not a true rememberer or invoker. Since the remembrance of God or invocation of God flows throughout every part of the true servant. Here's the concept of saryan, the flow. This does not mean one who invokes him with his tongue only, so that only the tongue perceives him, which is not the same as the perception of the whole man. You should try to understand the mystery implicit in the remembrance of those that are really forgetful. Indeed, that part of the forgetful man which invokes God is undoubtedly present with God, and the one remembered is its companion. The forgetful person as a whole, however, is not remembering, and he does not accompany one who is heedless. Man is multiple and not single of essence, while God is single of essence, but multiple with respect to the divine names. So also is the man of many parts, and the remembering or invocation by one part does not imply the remembering or invocation by any other part of him. God is with that part which is remembering him, the rest being described as forgetful. It is necessary that there should be some part of a man that is remembering God and that which God is present, so the rest of him might survive by his care for that one part. The reality does not, as death, have charge of the destruction of this creation, since it is not a matter of extinction so much as one of severance. God takes him to himself, and to him does the whole matter return. When God takes him to himself, he fashions for him a composite body, not the physical body, of a kind appropriate to the realm to which he has been transferred, which is that of eternal life by virtue of the equilibrium there. There he will never die, nor will his parts be separated again. As for the dwellers in the fire, they will indeed eventually attain to felicity, but in the fire itself, since after the period of punishment, the fire must needs become cool and safe, which is their felicity. The felicity of those in the fire after the fulfillment of certain rites of punishment is similar to that of Abraham when he was thrown into the fire. He was tortured by the sight of it and by what he was accustomed to think of it, being quite sure that it was something that would harm anything that came near it, being ignorant of God's purpose in it for him. However, after all these mental tortures, he found it cool and safe despite what he saw of its color and form. To the people there, it appeared as fire, showing that one and the same thing may appear differently to the various observers of it. Such is the self-manifestation of God. Either one may say that God manifests himself like that, or that the cosmos being looked at and into is like God in his self-manifestation. It is various in the eye of the beholder according to the makeup of that beholder. Or it is that the makeup of the beholder is various because of the variety of the manifestation. All this is possible with respect to the divine realities. If it were the case that any dead person or killed persons did not return to God when he died, God would not bring about the death of anyone or command his execution. All is within his grasp, so that there can never be any real loss. He commands execution and decrees death, secure in the knowledge that his servant can never escape him, but returns to him as is saying, to him does the whole matter revert, meaning that all disposal rests with him, the disposer, nor is there anything not of his essence outside of it. Indeed, his identity is the essence of each thing, which is what inspired the words, to him does the whole matter revert. Okay, that was the chapter of Jonah. And now the floor is open for questions, comments, insights, revelations, complaints, whatever you want to talk about. Anybody? Go ahead, Zachary. You don't have to raise your hand. Go ahead.
So, essentially, you see, this is something that I've tried to understand is that, okay, so number one, you shouldn't, pay an evil back with another evil. That's something that obviously is not something you should do as like what this chapter is communicating, but how would you deal in the case of like a situation where essentially you have unchecked evil, you have a tyrant, they're not accountable to anybody. I mean, the issue and allowing that to go forward, allowing that tyranny to basically be unleashed, a lot of innocent souls are being destroyed, and then they cannot reach the perfection they were created for. So it's kind of
I
this
I I couldn't agree more. In this chapter, at least when you read the Arabic, the implications of the things he's saying is that he does in fact leave room for that. He's talking in very specific cases, and he has a very specific intention in mind. For example, given the milieu that Ibn Arabi is coming from, he's thinking specifically of those Sufis, like say Hallaj or Ain al-Ghazat Hamadani and very similar ones, who because of their high theopathic state, right, would utter these very scandalous sounding things to the ears of the Orthodox, like Hallaj's an al-Haq, I am the truth, or the kind of things that Abu Yazid al-Bistami and similar were well known for. And then you have these fuqaha and Orthodox, and even some of the more establishment-oriented Sufis like Junaid Baghdadi, clamoring for the death of these individuals in the name of God and in the name of the Quran. This is the specific context that Ibn Arabi is talking from about this very specific situation, in that, when you use religion, right, as a reason to kill, whether it be for reasons of heresy or sectarian reasons or similar, this is the false dialectic that you have fallen into, because each side of this equation, right, is in fact got or it, right? So it is better not to kill, or it's not even better. It's not even it's actually a moral imperative to use that, to use a Kantian category. It is the categorical imperative not to kill, period, right? And so this is where he's coming from. But in a situation that we have, for example, right now, where we have a rogue terrorist state that is just unleashing genocide and mayhem on civilian populations. I'm not talking about militias or organizations. I have no time for any of these guys, whether we're talking about Hamas or Hezbollah or any of these various paramilitary organizations. I have absolutely no time for any of these. As you all know, I am no friend to the Islamic Republic of Iran and its leadership and elite. I stand with people, and so is Ibn Arabi. This is the vantage point that he's talking for. So he's talking from the level of the ground. If that is the case, what you're pointing out, that there is a power or a force or whatever that is wantonly taking life in the way, for example, the Zionists are at the moment, then all of the various injunctions that we have in the book apply. We're dealing with an oppressive power. We're dealing with a pharaoh. We're dealing with a pharaoh. We're dealing with a Nimrod, right? And so all the caveats that are spoken about in the Quran or even the Bible itself apply to this particular power, namely the Zionists. And so you can argue that based on the argument that Ibn Arabi is presenting in this particular chapter, that there is a basis for a kind of a notion of collective security in a very kind of loose kind of way. That if you have a fascistic power, whether we're talking about Israel today or the Third Reich during the Second World War or similar, kind of powers in the world, then it is incumbent to stop this kind of power by any means necessary, and that if this power is not stopped and continues on its killing spree, that this is a threat to God's creation. And so from one vantage point, one can claim that such powers that wantonly and aggressively are constantly taking life in the manner that we are finding with the Zionists should be stopped, and by any means necessary. But by a collective of humanity, not just by groups of proxy militia organizations and paramilitaries and similar.
Yeah, it's just I guess the issue being is that, I mean, technically it would still like stopping them, and of course stopping them, the only way to do so is by force, because you can't do it legally, you can't really do it peacefully. There's really nothing you can do in cases like this. It would that technically, like, it would still count from the wide perspective of being, repaying evil with evil, but then at the same time, it's basically it's a necessity to do it. Like, there's no real. It's kind of like you're in a no-win situation, I guess.
Look, fascist powers, given the history that we know, right? When we're talking about rules of engagement, and there are very, very specific things in Hadith literature that the Prophet was advising the Muslimun during the war with the Meccans, is not to target civilians, not to target women and children, that certain rules of engagement should be adhered to, and that you only target the enemy combatant only, right? Now, in the present conflict, we have been seeing that at least Hezbollah has been sort of, to some degree, adhering to this principle, although it can be argued that when they're throwing rockets across the border from Lebanon that are hitting these civilian residential areas that are maybe in somewhat close proximity to some kind of military installation, that they're kind of violating that rule, right? But the classical Islamic rules of engagement that are transmitted to Hadith are very unequivocal, that in a war situation, that combatants should only be targeting combatants. Women, children, non-combatant civilians are completely untouchable per the actual principle itself. Unfortunately, none of these groups have ever adhered to this, and Hezbollah's own track record in Syria, for example, during that that war there was atrocious. There was one point at the point where Hamas and Hezbollah had a falling out, and Hamas was briefly supporting these some of these Sunni Takfiri organizations. Hezbollah starved an entire Palestinian refugee camp in Syria, and is accused of atrocities against the people in that Syrian refugee camp of Palestinians. So, these sorts of things need to be, when people get on bandwagons right now, they need to also kind of keep a lot of these sorts of incidents of these various organizations and their own behavior in the past before kind of jumping on a bandwagon as to who's the good guy and the bad guy. But in the overall situation of things, the bigger bully here is none other than Israel. And so by the kind of rules and principles that Ibn Arabi is articulated in the larger context and subtext behind what he's saying, it is incumbent to stop this bully called Israel by any means necessary. But this requires a collective will. You cannot enshrine this collective will, whether in a single state or even in a single organization. It has to be a collective effort, whether by the collectivity of the Muslimun themselves or by the collective of humanity, whether they're Muslim or not. Unfortunately, the reality of the situation and the reality of the world that we live in today is that there's neither a collective will amongst the Muslimun. Most of the Muslim powers today are more interested, at least their elites are more interested in their lining their pockets and normalizing relations with the Zionist entity than they are in serving their own people. So there is no attempt to create a collective will to confront this Zionist fascist monster on the terms that it should be confronted. And on the level of humanity, we see what's going on in international community. You have the United States, who is arming this colonial settler outpost apartheid state, and it talks through two sides of its mouth. On the one hand, it talks about de-escalation, and then says things that we need de-escalation through escalation. Then it claims that it wants to pursue diplomatic efforts to bring calm the situation down, while it is arming and selling the most sophisticated weaponry to this state. So this is the mess that we're in, where the very country that is supposedly the upholder of a international rule-based order is the one that defies it more than anybody else. And this is not just in the case of the present conflict. They've done that in the case of more recently in the case of Eastern Europe and Ukraine. They've done it in Southeast Asia. America has never adhered to a international rules-based order ever. Whether at the end of the Second World War, when it established the United Nations, or subsequently. And this is the problem that we have, and this is the solution that Ibn Arabi is suggesting to us, not just from a legal standpoint, but from a metaphysical standpoint. And I think that thinkers and figures such as Ibn Arabi kind of fill in a very important context to what has been missing in the kind of international legal thinking that we have had in the West. Because Ibn Arabi is deriving the same principle, but from metaphysical principles rather than from legal and historical principles. And if these two were somehow brought together, and state actors were forced to adhere to them, at the risk of getting their own backsides kicked somehow, then we would have a better world. Because the metaphysical principle here is very clear on the part of Ibn Arabi, that to kill, and especially to kill on a collective level, is not just a form of human. You're actually engaging in deicide. Let's call it what it is. This is what Ibn Arabi is saying. This is deicide, not just a genocide of humans, but it's also the killing of God. And anyone who lauds that, by any definition from the Abrahamic tradition, is satanic. Period.
It makes a lot of sense. There's a lot to think about there. I'm just kind of still trying to understand that. Yeah.
I mean, this what he articulates in that first paragraph, for the time that he articulated in the manner which he articulated, just shows how unbelievably ahead of his time he was. But it also shows how little, these monumental figures of our culture get the credit that they deserve. Ibn Arabi was saying this stuff about 500, nearly 600 years before the beginning of the European Enlightenment, who, apparently formulated these concepts. But here it is right there in a chapter of the Fusus al-Hikam itself. Human rights. Based on what? On the rights of God. And what's ironic is that this kind of argument is not even echoed by many of the fuqaha. And, I had a very interesting conversation with this gentleman in Germany who had studied briefly at the Hose in Qom, where we actually discussed this very chapter. And he said that he got into a real big argument at one point with his own teacher of fiqh because he was simultaneously studying fiqh and also hikmah at the Qom Theological Seminary, and he got drawn to what Ibn Arabi was saying, and he kept on saying that we have the very principles that these Westerners are claiming that we don't have. Why are we not exploring our jurisprudence based on these sorts of principles rather than some of the more lockjawed, straitjacketed points of view of those who don't adhere to this irfani kind of perspective? Maybe then if we pursued our jurisprudence from this kind of a perspective, we would be not only at a level of parity with the West, but we would even go beyond the West in terms of our, judicial and juridical and jurisprudential philosophy. And this faqih was just like, was not going to give an inch to this guy. And so he left the seminary altogether because of it.
Yeah, I think it's a conflict. I just wanted to say it's just like the conflict between, maintaining the state through violence and, these kind of higher principles. So even in a religiously, oriented state like that was built on a religious revolution, quote unquote, like Iran, it's still something that it's contradictory. Like the foundation is violent, but these principles aren't, and you can't really
This
reconcile that.
100%. The utter hypocrisy of the Ayatollah Khomeini and his heirs is contained in this very chapter. Khomeini built his career in the Hawza at the Fayziyah in Qom on teaching Ibn Arabi and his commentators, and then Mullah Sadra. Yet, the behavior of the Ayatollah Khomeini in his political career is completely the opposite of what Ibn Arabi is saying. In terms of, because this is what he's laying out is a doctrine of human rights grounded in metaphysics. Yet this wasn't the behavior of Khomeini from the moment that he set foot in Iran as the leader of the so-called Islamic Revolution.
Saidi, what do you think is the reason that our fuqaha and Islamic scholars and maybe as a full scale, the Muslims, we are so literal and we do not stick to this beautiful rule that to be compassionate to the creation, which creation is created in the image of God, it is much more important than to be envy about applying every single rule which is given by God.
But is this not a rule? خلق الله آدم على صورته. I mean, why is this not considered a rule in itself? This is the question, the rhetorical question that Ibn Arabi is asking everybody in this chapter. If you say, things like Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy an Munkar are rules, to enjoin the good and to thwart evil, then this itself, which is a Quranic verse, as well as then echoed again in Hadith, why do you say that this is not a rule? Why cannot we enshrine this as a principle of fiqh? And this is a question that, as far as I'm aware, no school of fiqh, whether the 4 or 5 Sunni schools and the Jafari school have yet to properly answer. Even though it's in the Quran, and if the whole contents of the Sharia are supposed to be in the Quran, who is picking and choosing as to which consists of the rule-based principles of the Sharia and which are not? I mean, it certainly isn't the Imams, upon them be peace, who are saying what you should consider and what you shouldn't. I mean, I've read through all 110 volumes of the Bihar al-Anwar. I've yet to find one statement by any of them that would discard this as a principle of Sharia.
I have a theory
Sure.
about it. Well, sorry, just close my window. I I think that when you're operating a society at a small scale, that you can use these principles. Similarly, like that socialism will work well at a small scale, which it does, like organically, because people have relationships with one another, and so there's no anonymity. So as soon as there's an anonymous factor introduced because the population exceeds a certain threshold, I've noticed that these, some degree of authoritarianism enters. Although that's a generalization, because I could look at indigenous cultures here where
No,
they were operating at small
it
scale,
is.
and they had capital punishment.
Sure.
You
It is a generalization, but at the same token, it is a correct observation. This is one of the reasons why, in the post-World War II period, a lot of jurisprudence were arguing for a human rights-based international order for precisely that very reason that you're talking about. Because of the kind of anonymity that creeps in after a certain community grows outside of its population bounds, then it is that much easier to demonize other human beings, as the Germans proved, during the 1930s. Whereas if you have a human rights-based international order enshrined in an international law, at least it constrains state actors in theory from engaging in that kind of behavior that will then eventually lead to, a Holocaust or genocide and similar. This was the reasoning of a lot of these legal thinkers in the post-World War II period. But the observation is correct, because when it is at a local level, when you're dealing with people that when you're living in a small community, let's say even of 1,000 or 2,000 people.
In a village.
In a village. Everybody knows everybody. And so on the one hand, there's a constraint on behavior by individuals themselves by virtue of the fact that everybody knows each other. And then the second thing is that, so therefore people are more reluctant to engage in egregious ethical behaviors when people know each other, right? But the village always grows. So then the question becomes, what is the most efficient way of managing the village while without creating a sort of administration that will become authoritarian? And this has been the challenge that humanity has been facing in every form of polity that is created from the time it crawled out of the amoeba soup, right? In contemporary political or contemporary democratic political theory, and especially some of the stuff I've been reading in the last couple of years, suggests that, in fact, decentralization, that if you make, even if you have a community that has grown outside of its population bounds and needs management, that if you segmentize each of these population centers into smaller and smaller portions and then allow decentralization, so more autonomy, more self-administration and that sort of thing, then you're also obviating the necessity of being authoritarian or imposing authoritarian structures of government just to make everything run. This is some of the things that they've been saying, and they have in fact been exempling what is no longer called primitive communities and primitive models of social organization to that end, because they're seeing that there is actually a very optimum way of running things at a smaller level. So if you have more, smaller group of people clustering together, and then allow these people to elect their own representatives to administer their immediate needs in that community, things run better.
Sure. I mean, when I look at some of the stories of how Sharia was applied in our village in Lebanon, from my father, there were examples of capital punishment and, killings. And that was within a village at a relatively small scale, right? So on the one hand, you've got this fairly established trend from anthropological research that as the population grows, the homicides increase, right? Because of the competition pressures, right?
Exactly.
But then on the other hand, Yeah, but you can look at these small scale, tribal cultures and see that sort of capital punishment operation. And I think it's one thing I personally realize is that it's very easy to judge it from a position of Western sort of privilege where we have police and courts. If you have somewhere where there's no army, there's no police, there's no forensic, there's no courts, trying to keep mercy, apply the principle of mercy, which is to protect the innocent, right, from the occasional psychopaths and exploiters, it's extremely difficult. And when I used to teach, in high schools, there was an exercise I would give kids to, you've got an island, you've got some resources, and how are you going to govern it? I'm telling you to make up your own rules for what happens if people take more than they should or something. And you'd be amazed at how quickly they go to capital punishment. As like, what if they keep pushing that and pushing that,
From what I understand, both my readings and discussions with some of the local indigenous people here is that in their various tribal societies before, the white man came, that they did have, penal rules. So, for example, about hoarding or stealing resources from the community. They had a warning-based system that if it was continually infringed upon, at the end of this process would lead to the death penalty. So like the first time, if like say a young man, tried to jump one of the women, one of the married or unmarried women of the tribe, he would be ostracized for like a specific number of days or months or whatever. The second time he would be speared. So the men would take him out and spear him in his hand or his feet or whatever. And it was only on the third time, if he did the same thing again, that they would take him out and spear him to death. So these penal and punitive measures did exist, but at least the locals here, from what they know of their own experience, they had a warning base. The kind of a very similar kind of to the 3 strikes and you're out kind of system. And one thing that one of them said to me that it was always the relatives or even the parent or even a family member of the infringer that would be required to impose the penalty.
Yeah, I mean there's also research showing that the countries that have a concept of hell have lower crime rates. So it goes along with the same sort of thing that if you don't have the infrastructure of law enforcement through violence, right? Because the threat of getting killed is within our own society. You could get shot by cops or something. It's how order is enforced. When you don't have that, then you have to have other means of protecting people and deterring, sin, basically. I mean, my cousin used to when she lived in Dubai, she would put her suitcase out on the footpath and go back into her hotel and wait for the taxi, and no one would take it because it was instant deportation if you committed any sort of crime. And it's impossible for us to comprehend that level of safety. So I think there's, in terms of the static morality of it, right?
Sure. But
difficult.
Look what Ibn Arabi is saying or implying in this chapter. He is saying that there is no sin higher and greater than murder. Period. He's putting, he says, he's basically saying that if you want to privilege any crime above everything else, it's not adultery, it's not theft, it's not blasphemy, it is murder.
I think that's a universal value, one of the few universal
You would be surprised.
values.
You would be surprised how many people don't see that, Vanessa.
But doesn't the Hebrew translate in the first commandment as thou shalt not kill, but the word is actually murder. So there's a difference between killing, say, to eat or self-defense versus murder.
Thou shalt not murder. And basically the context is, if you keep on reading into the Old Testament, meant basically other Israelites. It didn't mean the Amalekites. It didn't mean the Canaanites. It didn't mean the people of Jericho. It didn't mean any of the people. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Just meant other Israelites you don't kill.
Typical.
So the rules of Yahweh did not apply, apparently, to other peoples besides the Israelites.
Mm.
So, that the rules of the God of Israel only apply to the Israelites themselves and not beyond them. That's what makes, at least, the Christianity that emerges out of the Gospels so radical compared to the Judaism of the Old Testament. Because what the figure of Jesus seeks to do, based on the gospel narrative, is to universalize this and say, no, these rules are beyond just the nation of Israel itself. They apply to all of humanity, all of creation, not just to Israelites and Hebrews and Jews.
Why is there's a theory I've heard that he was, or positioned that Jesus was only preaching to the Israelites? Do you think there's evidence for that, or?
Well, he was preaching in the outward world only to other Jews and other, Aramaic speaking people of that time. But if you take the synoptic gospels on face value, now the question of whether they're authentic or not is beside the point. We're talking about the message of the synoptic gospels in itself is speaking beyond just the Jews. When, for example, he says things, I have not come to break the law, but to fulfill the law, right? And then he then moralizes elements of the law in his Sermon on the Mount. Then this is clearly attempting to universalize these elements of the law in the way that they appear to the Jews since the time of Moses, beyond the Jews. So Jesus is not, at least from the perspective of the synoptic gospels, Jesus is not just talking about a tribal God. Whereas everything that precedes Jesus is talking about a people and their tribal God against the world.
Mm. But is there anything directly that you feel qualifies that he was speaking beyond the Jews?
Yes,
or
when his confrontation with the scribes and Pharisees, when he tells them off after overturning the stalls of the users of moneylenders, and the kind of things that he says to these Pharisees and scribes, is very much that he's telling them that your law is not worth a spittle.
Mm.
That your law is a burden even unto the people that are meant to apply it, meaning other Jews. So what does that imply? That implies that if you want to talk it from a Ismaili or the Batini perspective, that means that Jesus is proclaiming the Qiyamah, and he's universalizing the limitation that the law of Moses had up to that moment.
Mm. Mm.
And I've found that particular incident in the temple, and it's always jaded me why other people have not picked up on it. Jesus is in the temple. He is confronting the priests in the temple, and he's declaring these so-called representatives and upholders of the law of Moses to their faces to be hypocrites, vipers, etc., as he overturns their source of income and all the rest of that. That is such a beautiful, profound, and impactful image of the resurrection, of the Qiyamah, beyond this whole, Jesus rose from the dead after 3 days. That, to me, is the quintessential Jesus, proclaiming the Qiyamah in the temple.
Mm.
And that means that he was universalizing, on one level, the spirit of the law of Moses beyond its confines. And so it's no longer with him, it's no longer about a tribal God of a single people.
Mm. Yeah, it reminds me of the sort of current Islamic, so-called Islamic, but they're just, rich, corrupt Meccans, essentially, who are not, they're not living the truth of Islam. They're just the equivalent of the merchants.
Yeah. And they have been since the time of the Prophet, and that is the reason why we have the verse, Inna al-Arabu ashaddu kufran wa nifaq. The Prophet and God saw this stuff about these Arabs all that time. There is The Arabs are the most intense in hypocrisy and duplicity. This is in the Quran.
Mm.
You can't call this racism unless you want to accuse the Quran and Allah of being racist.
Someone will do it.
Want to add one or two questions. So again, speaking of this general principle of mercy, then Sheikh Muhyiddin connects it with the conception of dhikr, maybe hinting that only the people of dhikr, which realize the internal spirit of the law, are capable to see that it is the Rahmah which has the priority over the creation, over the following literally the rules of God. And to comment on that, and the other point, when he is saying about the people who are doing the zikr only with their tongues, but even this matters, because when you do zikr with the tongue, figuratively speaking, God is present with your tongue. He hints to the idea that there is no person who is 100% absent of God, because there is always some part of the person who is making zikr. It could be he could be silent but remembering God with his heart, or he could be absent but he is looking at some beautiful scan in the nature. He is doing zikr with the eyes.
What Ibn Arabi is kind of in a very roundabout way kind of pointing out to, and we have this even, in the literature of exoteric fiqh, is this whole thing about shakiyat, right? Where people pray and they're thinking about other things. So someone is performing the salat, and through the whole thing, he's thinking about his car keys or the argument he had with his wife or what he ate for breakfast, all that kind of stuff. And so implicitly, what Ibn Arabi is criticizing is that attitude that that if you cannot reach that point of concentration where you are invoking with your being and not just with your tongue, right? Then you are amongst the ghafilin. You're amongst the eatless. It's simple as that. And we have this even in the literature of the fiqh, and not just amongst the Shia, but also amongst the Sunni, which has been a debate that if your mind is not focused on the prayer, are you really praying? Yeah, sure, go through the motions of the 5 days salat, 5 times salat a day, or 3 times your Shia. And throughout that entire thing, all you're doing is you're doing things in the zahir, while in your mind and in your heart, you're somewhere else. That's not doing the salat.
The camels
with the zikr. If you are just repeating a name with your tongue and your mind is concentrated on your car keys, on what you had for breakfast and the argument you had with your coworker, then you're not doing the zikr.
I completely agree on that, but I would like to comment a little bit more on the opposite end, that even it is not zikr, but still there is some even minimal value of this, and that there is always a part of the body which is present with God, and exactly this part, it is the reason that the whole is kept and it is preserved.
Based on the principle of Saryan, right? The flow and the circulation of things and he says this sort of in a kind of a vague sort of way, that even the heedless person, when they are doing the dhikr, on some level are doing the dhikr, even though their mind might be heedless and their heart might be heedless. But by the principle of the saryan, the circulation and flow of being in everything, even in that state of heedlessness, they are on some very low and kind of delimited level they are doing the zikr. Yes, so he does sort of allude to that. But from the perspective of the muhaqqiqun, from the perspective of the verifiers, that still is not enough, because you need to be attentive with every level of your being, right? And there's also a kind of a utilitarian reason for that, and that is that, and he says it, humans and creation are multiple, right? And God is singular. And the whole point of the exercise of a salik is to be able to reach that state of wahda or wahdaniya that God is already always in, right? And that is why it is not enough simply to do the zikr by the tongue, that you have to do zikr with your whole being, because the whole journey is in being to become one.
So that we should be singular in our zikr, in the
Yes.
meaning that it encompasses.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you.
Because this is also implicitly, and some of the commentators point this out, that this, what Ibn Arabi is actually pointing out is a facet of the takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, what he just said there about the zikr, for the salik, maybe not for the awam, but for the salik and for the khawas. This is a very specific indication of the takhalluq bi akhlaqillah. Yeah. Taking on God's character traits. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Am I able to interject with a quick?
Sure.
Surely you must know this story. It's that the dervish comes to his friend and says, "If you can get all the way through the zikr without thinking of anything else, I'll give you one of my camels." And so the friend gets through the zikr, and being honest, he says at the end, when he's asked, "Did you think of anything else?" He said, "Yeah, I did." He said, "What did you think of?" He said, "Whether I wanted the brown one or the white one."
Yeah, I know that story is correct. Yeah.
I just want to interject one thing too.
Sure.
I'm always using, musical analogies, so I might as well use one here. Just in one word, focus. You need focus. If you want to play a song on your guitar, it's not going to happen unless you're focused on it. And you can't be thinking about what you're going to have for dinner. You can't think about what dinner and perform music at the same time. It's just impossible. So if you want one thing, you need, if you want to produce the music, you have to be single-minded and focused on that. And like you said, get in the flow and the circulation of the energy and of the music. And everything else has to take a backseat and disappear for a little while.
Yeah.
That's all I wanted to say.
Well, I mean, that is the correct observation, because what that leads to, that kind of single-mindedness and focus leads you precisely to the goal. Whereas the opposite doesn't, even though, sure, it's part of the greater circulation of being. And even if you're doing it with your tongue and your mind is somewhere else, you're still kind of participating in being, as it were, but you're not really moving towards its center, as it were. And that's why musicians and good musicians understand, I think, the suluk and just the practice of meditation much better than others, because of that very reason you just put your finger on.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? All right. We'll leave it here for this week, especially because I gotta kind of scoot out of here in the next 5-10 minutes. Let us now then, I guess, begin the next chapter, which is the chapter of Job, I believe, is it? Yeah, it's chapter of Job. And the zikr, associated with that is Ya Muqayyibu, the one that makes things hidden or unseen. And this is also a very short chapter, and but it has some very interesting kind of observations. This one we just read has always struck me as one of the most succinct statements about, a legal-based human rights order being articulated by someone 800, almost 900 years ago. 400 or 500 years before the West even discovered this idea. And it's right there in Ibn Arabi himself, on a metaphysical basis. Anyway, let's leave it here for this week. Let's everybody come back again, same time next week. And until next week, ya Nafisu.